Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to walk through where things actually stand on the front line, in the skies and in Kiev's corridors of power, because there's a lot moving right now and most of it doesn't fit into a single headline. So let's take it piece by piece, starting with the ground war, then the strikes deep inside Russia, and finally the political shakeup happening in Ukraine's government this week, because that last part is genuinely significant and worth understanding properly rather than glossing over. Let's begin with Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, because for well over a year, this pair of towns in western Donetsk, Oblast, has been the single most fought over patch of ground in this entire war. Russia poured enormous resources into capturing them, and by early this year, independent monitors, including the Institute for the Study of War, had assessed that Russian forces had effectively taken control of both. That's not in dispute anymore. What is worth paying attention to is what happened after that capture, because this is where the story gets more interesting than the simple "City Falls" headline suggests. Multiple independent battlefield trackers have noted that, despite officially claiming both towns, Russian forces have struggled to translate that costly, grinding win into anything resembling a breakout. There's been no major push west of Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad since the tail end of last year. The fighting there has essentially become a case study in what analysts are now calling attritional stalemate. Russia can still throw assault groups forward, small units probing and infiltrating, but converting those tactical nibbles into operational momentum has become progressively harder for them. Ukrainian units, including elements of the Airborne and Rapid Response Corps operating in that sector, continue to contest positions in the northern parts of both towns, and the fighting there remains genuinely fluid rather than settled. Now, why does that matter beyond the immediate tactical picture? Because Pokrovsk was supposed to be the gateway. It was the logistics hub, the rail and road junction that Russian planners needed in order to push further into the rest of Donetsk Oblast. Having spent well over a year, and by most independent estimates, an enormous number of casualties to take it, Russia now finds itself sitting in the ruins of a town that no longer functions as the springboard it was meant to be. Analysts looking at the wider trend line have pointed out something worth repeating clearly. It now takes a Russian army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, grinding for months at a time, to secure a single meaningful settlement. That is a very different tempo from the sweeping territorial gains Russia was making back in 2022 and parts of 2023. This year's spring and summer campaigning seasons have simply not delivered what Moscow was hoping for, and several research groups tracking daily territorial control changes have found that Russia's net gains have been shrinking month over month, with some assessments suggesting that in certain recent months, Russian forces may have lost more ground to counterattacks than they captured. Let's move a little south and east to Kostiantynivka, because this is the next major population center Russia has been trying to encircle, and here the picture is more mixed. Russian forces have pushed into parts of the town and have claimed footholds inside some neighborhoods, and there has also been reported Russian movement towards Sloviansk, which sits roughly 30-something kilometers further north, and represents a genuinely important prize because Sloviansk and its twin city Kramatorsk together form the last major urban stronghold Ukraine holds in Donetsk Oblast. But here's the important nuance that gets lost in a lot of coverage. Independent battlefield analysts have specifically flagged that even where Russia has achieved a tactical win around Kostiantynivka, there's little sign that this sets up a rapid follow-on victory anywhere else. It took a massive, sustained effort just to get that single result. The terrain between Kostiantynivka and Sloviansk, and further on toward Kramatorsk, is heavily fortified, mined, and constantly watched by Ukrainian drone reconnaissance, which means any further Russian advance is going to be slow, expensive, and contested every single kilometer of the way. Ukrainian command has also acknowledged tactical withdrawals in this general area when holding a position stopped making sense. For example, Ukrainian forces pulled back from Siversk at one point, specifically to preserve personnel and combat power, rather than get ground down defending a position that had become a liability. That's not weakness. That's a deliberate trade of terrain for force preservation. And it's been a consistent theme in how Ukraine's current military leadership approaches this war. Don't bleed your infantry defending a pile of rubble if you can pull back to a stronger line and make the enemy pay to advance further. Which brings us to the manpower question, because this is genuinely one of the most important dynamics of the war right now and doesn't get nearly enough attention. Ukraine has an acknowledged and persistent infantry shortage. That's not something Ukrainian officials try to hide. It's been discussed openly by military leadership for a long time now. The response to that shortage has been a heavy investment in technology, layered drone reconnaissance, first-person view strike drones, electronic warfare, and increasingly unmanned ground vehicles used for logistics and even some assault roles, all aimed at reducing how many soldiers need to be physically exposed in the most dangerous spots. On the other side of the line, Russia has actually been dealing with its own version of the same problem in certain sectors. Ukrainian officials, including President Zelensky, have pointed to infantry ratios in some parts of the Pokrovsk sector running as high as 8-1 in Russia's favor at the height of that battle. And yet, despite that numerical advantage, independent casualty assessments, including from Western research institutions tracking the conflict, have suggested Russian losses in recent months have been running roughly 8 times higher than Ukrainian losses in the same fighting. If that ratio holds anywhere close to accurate, it tells you something important. Russia has been substituting sheer numbers of soldiers for the tactical and technological edge it doesn't have, and it's paying an extraordinarily steep price to grind forward at a pace that, on the current trajectory, would take years to reach any of Moscow's larger stated objectives. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it connects directly to the political question of mobilization. There's been persistent discussion, both from Western analysts and increasingly from voices inside Russia itself, that the Kremlin may need to turn to another large-scale mobilization wave to sustain this pace of losses. Whether that actually happens, and at what scale, remains to be seen. This is speculative territory, and I want to be upfront about that rather than presenting it as settled fact. But the pressure points are real. Russian military bloggers, some of whom are nominally pro-war, have been increasingly vocal online about equipment shortages, command failures, and frustration with how the war is being managed, even while continuing to support the broader goal of the invasion. That kind of grumbling from within a system that heavily polices dissent is itself a signal worth noting. Let's shift now to the south, toward Zaporizhzhia and the corridor stretching down toward the Sea of Azov, because there's meaningful activity happening there too, even if it hasn't produced dramatic territorial swings. Both sides have intensified operations in this sector. Russian planners continue probing for weaknesses that could open a path toward key transport corridors, while Ukrainian forces have been running local counterattacks and longer-range strikes to disrupt those preparations before they can build into anything larger. Ukrainian airborne units operating in this general direction have been conducting what's often described as a slow, deliberate push to reclaim contested villages, using extensive drone surveillance, electronic warfare cover, and carefully prepared infiltration groups rather than large frontal assaults. This mirrors, in some ways, tactics Russia itself pioneered earlier in the war, but with a different emphasis. Ukrainian commanders have repeatedly stressed that preserving infantry lives is the top priority even when it slows the pace of an advance. Villages in contested zones often sit in what battlefield mapping projects classify as gray zone territory for extended periods, meaning neither side has a fully confirmed, uncontested presence, because small infiltration groups from either side can still be operating there even after a settlement is nominally reported as liberated or captured. That ambiguity is a normal, expected feature of how modern drone-saturated front lines actually look, not evidence of exaggeration on anyone's part. Now let's talk about the deep strikes, because this is where the war has genuinely transformed the most over the past year or so. Ukraine has built out a serious long-range strike capability combining domestically produced drones with a range of missile systems, and it has been using that capability relentlessly against Russian oil refining and energy infrastructure. The cumulative effect has been significant. Independent financial and energy analysts, including reporting from major international outlets, have assessed that Russia's refining capacity has fallen to its lowest level in more than 2 decades, as a direct result of sustained Ukrainian strikes on refineries, storage depots, and associated infrastructure. That's a striking figure by any measure, and it's had knock-on effects. Reports have emerged of Russia resorting to improvised methods to move fuel toward frontline units, including concealing shipments under tarpaulins and among agricultural cargo, which tells you something about how disrupted the normal supply chain has become. Just this week, Ukraine's general staff reported fresh strikes hitting Russian refining facilities, including the Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat complex and the Afipsky refinery, alongside a separate wave of strikes against multiple vessels. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a sustained campaign that's been running for many months now, and the cumulative damage to Russia's energy sector has become one of the most consequential aspects of the entire war, arguably more strategically significant in the long run than any single ground battle. The maritime side of this campaign deserves its own mention. Ukraine has developed and deployed naval drones, remotely operated strike boats, that have repeatedly targeted Russian vessels in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, including near ports like Novorossiysk and in waters close to Kerch. These strikes have damaged or destroyed a range of targets, from smaller patrol and Coast Guard vessels up to larger ships, and they've forced Russia into a defensive posture around its own coastline that would have seemed almost unthinkable a few years into this war, given that Ukraine doesn't operate a conventional navy of any real size. Just this week, Ukraine's military reported sinking a Russian border guard vessel that had reportedly been involved in the 2018 Kerch Strait incident, which Ukrainian officials framed explicitly as a long-delayed reckoning. I want to be careful here about precise casualty and vessel loss figures, because exact numbers circulating on social media and in some commentary channels are often difficult to independently verify in real time. And I'd rather point you toward the general, well-documented trend, sustained and effective Ukrainian pressure on Russian naval and energy assets, than repeat specific tallies that haven't been confirmed by multiple independent sources. Let's also touch on the human cost, because it's easy in a battlefield tracker-style rundown to lose sight of what all of this actually means. According to figures released by Ukraine's general staff, cumulative Russian personnel losses since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022 are now reported to be in excess of 4 million, a figure that includes killed, wounded, and otherwise incapacitated troops. That number comes from the Ukrainian side and should be understood as their own official tally rather than an independently audited figure, but it's consistent with the broader pattern that Western intelligence assessments and independent research groups have also converged on. This war has produced casualty levels for Russia's military that are extraordinarily high, relative to any territorial gains achieved, especially over the past year. Now let's turn to the political situation inside Ukraine, because there's a genuinely major story breaking right now that's worth understanding in some detail. Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, has just voted to accept the resignation of Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko, which formally dismisses her entire government and sets off a broader cabinet reshuffle. This wasn't a slow-building crisis. President Zelensky announced only a couple of days earlier that he believed the government needed what he called a reset, and the resignation followed quickly after. Sviridenko had served just over a year in the role, having led the government throughout a period that included some of the most intense fighting of the war. There's active speculation, not yet confirmed, that she could move into a different senior post, potentially something connected to managing Ukraine's relationship with its most important international partner, though as of this recording, she reportedly hadn't accepted any specific new assignment. The reshuffle appears to extend well beyond just the Prime Minister's office. Reporting indicates that Denis Shmyhal, who previously served as both Prime Minister and briefly as Defense Minister earlier in the war, is being discussed as a potential replacement for the current Defense Minister, Rustem Umerov, who himself is reportedly expected to move into an ambassadorial role representing Ukraine in Washington. There are also reports that other senior officials are being shuffled out, including a Deputy Prime Minister currently facing a corruption investigation, and a Strategic Industries Minister whose department may be folded directly into the Ministry of Defense. Zelensky, in laying out priorities for the incoming government, has emphasized a short list of goals: ramping up domestic weapons production, fully contracting the drone volumes Ukraine's armed forces need, pushing through deregulation to unlock more of the country's internal economic capacity, and continuing to secure international support. I want to flag something here that connects directly back to concerns that have circulated in Ukrainian media and among defense commentators. The question of who actually ends up running the Ministry of Defense matters enormously right now, precisely because of everything we just discussed regarding drone production, ammunition manufacturing, and the pace of battlefield innovation that Ukraine has increasingly had to rely on to offset its manpower disadvantage. Any disruption to that ministry's leadership and institutional continuity carries real risk, and it's understandable that this is being watched closely both inside Ukraine and by its Western partners. At the same time, it's worth being cautious about assuming the worst before the new appointments are actually confirmed. Ukrainian governance during wartime has, for better or worse, involved fairly frequent personnel changes at senior levels, often tied to genuine disputes over corruption, procurement reform, and institutional turf battles, rather than any change in the underlying strategic direction of the war effort. There have been real documented controversies around defense procurement in Ukraine over the past couple of years. Disputes over contract renewals at the Defense Procurement Agency, allegations about the independence of oversight boards, and periodic anti-corruption investigations touching senior defense officials. These aren't fabricated grievances. They've been reported extensively by independent Ukrainian outlets and covered by international wire services, and G7 governments have publicly weighed in at points to press for stronger governance standards, given how much Western military and financial aid flows through these institutions. So when people express concern about a defense ministry shakeup, that concern is rooted in a real pattern, not just anxiety for its own sake. Separately, there's continued diplomatic activity worth noting. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was reportedly preparing to visit Kyiv with a defense-focused agenda, with a combined European support package under discussion worth somewhere in the range of 18 billion euros. France's president also announced this week that France would allow Ukraine to begin producing French-designed missiles and air defense systems domestically, marking the first time France has licensed weapons production of that kind to take place inside Ukraine. Both of these developments matter because they speak to the broader question of sustainability. whether Ukraine can keep building out its own production base rather than remaining entirely dependent on the pace of foreign shipments, which has been a recurring bottleneck throughout the war. Let's zoom back out to the strategic picture, because I think it's worth being honest about what all of this adds up to without overstating it in either direction. Russia does still hold significant real advantages in this war. A much larger population to draw on for mobilization, a defense industrial base that continues to produce large volumes of artillery shells, drones, and increasingly ballistic missiles, and a political system that faces essentially no meaningful internal check on how long the leadership chooses to continue the war. Some reporting has suggested Russia's missile production has scaled up to the point where it's producing several ballistic missiles per day, enough that a single mass strike on Kyiv could outstrip the annual output of an ally's air defense interceptor production.
That's a sobering data point, and it underlines that even as Russia struggles on the ground, its capacity to inflict damage through the air remains a serious and growing threat that Ukrainian civilians continue to face on a near-daily basis. At the same time, the ground war tells a fairly consistent story right now. Russia's territorial gains have slowed dramatically compared to earlier phases of the war. The cost per kilometer of advance has grown enormously in terms of both personnel and equipment, and Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated the capacity not just to hold defensive lines but to conduct meaningful counterattacks that claw back territory, including in sectors like the direction north of Zaporizhia, where Deep State and other open-source mapping projects have documented Ukrainian advances over recent months. Ukraine's own military leadership has stated that Ukrainian forces recaptured several hundred square kilometers of territory earlier this summer, reversing some Russian gains from prior months. None of that erases the reality that Russia still occupies a substantial portion of Ukrainian territory, or that the fighting remains brutal and costly for both sides. But it does mean that the narrative of an inevitable, unstoppable Russian advance simply isn't well supported by what independent trackers are actually observing on the ground month to month. On the diplomatic front, there's been no real movement toward a ceasefire or negotiated settlement that either side would actually accept. Russian officials have continued to insist on conditions that would require Ukraine to withdraw from fortified defensive positions before any formal negotiations could even begin, which Ukrainian officials have consistently characterized as an unreasonable precondition rather than a genuine opening for talks. Ukrainian leadership has repeatedly signaled openness to a ceasefire along something close to the current line of contact, but that offer has not been matched by any comparable flexibility from Moscow. This standoff over preconditions has essentially frozen any meaningful diplomatic track for a long stretch of this year, even as international mediators, including American officials at various points, have periodically floated frameworks intended to bridge the gap. I also want to mention the economic dimension one more time before wrapping up, because it's easy to focus purely on maps and troop movements and miss just how much this war has become a contest of industrial and financial endurance. The sustained Ukrainian campaign against Russian refineries has pushed Russia's domestic fuel production down to levels not seen in a very long time, with real documented knock-on effects for both civilian life inside Russia and military logistics at the front. At the same time, questions remain about how consistently European nations have followed through on commitments to wean themselves off Russian fossil fuel imports, and this remains a genuine point of friction and criticism from Ukrainian officials and commentators who argue that any continued revenue flowing to Moscow from energy sales undercuts the broader strategy of economic pressure. That's a legitimate and ongoing policy debate within European capitals, and it doesn't have a single clean resolution. Different countries are moving at different speeds, driven by their own energy security concerns and existing contracts. So where does all of this leave us? The war is now well into its fifth year, and the character of the fighting has changed substantially from where it started. Massed armored offensives have given way to a grinding, drone-saturated attritional struggle where control of the skies over any given few square kilometers, rather than sheer numbers of tanks, increasingly determines who can hold or take ground. Russia continues to press forward in select sectors, particularly around the Kostyant, Dnipropetrovsk, and Sloviansk approaches, and continues to rely heavily on long-range missile and drone strikes against Ukrainian cities as a way of maintaining pressure even as its ground offensive capacity has become constrained. Ukraine, for its part, continues to prioritize defense, force preservation, and technological substitution for its manpower shortfall, while simultaneously running an increasingly effective campaign of long-range strikes against Russian energy infrastructure and naval assets that has materially degraded Russia's war-supporting economy. And inside Kyiv, a significant government reshuffle is underway right now, with real uncertainty about who will end up leading the defense ministry at a moment when institutional continuity in that specific role matters more than almost any other point in the war. None of this points toward a quick resolution. It points toward continued, costly fighting, continued strikes on both sides' infrastructure and cities, and a political and diplomatic track that remains largely stalled because the core disagreement what happens to occupied territory and under what conditions any ceasefire or settlement could even be discussed hasn't meaningfully shifted. What has shifted, gradually and unevenly, is the balance of attrition. Russia is paying an extremely high price for very limited gains, its energy sector is under sustained and effective pressure, and its naval position in the Black Sea and Azov Sea has been eroded in ways that would have seemed unlikely a few years ago. Ukraine faces its own serious challenges. Manpower remains tight, political instability at the top of government creates real short-term risk, and the civilian population continues to endure regular missile and drone bombardment. Both realities are true at once, and I think that's the honest picture rather than a simple story of one side winning and the other losing. Let me add a bit more color on a few fronts we touched on only briefly, because I think they deserve fuller treatment. Start with the drone war itself, since it's genuinely reshaping how this conflict is fought at every level, not just at the very front edge of the trenches. First-person view drones, the small quadcopters flown directly into a target by an operator watching a video feed, have become so cheap and so plentiful on both sides that they now account for a very large share of vehicle and personnel losses in contested sectors that has changed basic battlefield behavior. Vehicles that would once have driven several kilometers up to a front position now have to dismount troops well back from the line and let soldiers walk the last stretch, because anything that moves in daylight within drone range risks being spotted and struck within minutes. Both militaries have poured resources into electronic warfare systems designed to jam or spoof drone control signals, which has in turn pushed engineers on both sides toward fiber optic controlled drones that can't be jammed at all because they're tethered to their operator by a thin cable instead of a radio link. It's a genuine technological arms race happening in real time, updated on a timescale of weeks rather than years, and it's a big part of why this war looks so different now than it did even 2 years ago. There's also been a growing role for autonomous and semi-autonomous ground systems. Ukraine has been experimenting with unmanned ground vehicles for logistics resupply, casualty evacuation, and in some cases direct assault or demining roles, specifically because sending a human being to drive a truck up a heavily surveilled road has become an increasingly dangerous proposition. Some reporting has described Ukraine as the first country to actually field combat-capable ground robots in a real operational context rather than just testing them, though it's worth noting that even with this investment, wheeled and tracked vehicles still handle the bulk of frontline logistics because the robotic systems remain limited in payload, range, and reliability compared to a human-driven truck. This is a technology still very much in its early iterative stage rather than a mature battlefield-winning capability, and it's best understood as one more tool being layered on to an already crowded and lethal battlefield rather than a silver bullet. On the air defense side, it's worth being honest about the strain both countries are under. Ukrainian cities continue to absorb large, coordinated waves of Russian missile and drone strikes, and Ukraine's air defense network, however much it has improved with Western-supplied systems, cannot intercept everything, especially during the largest combined strikes that mix ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and swarms of cheap decoy and attack drones designed specifically to overwhelm interceptor stocks. This is one of the areas where continued Western support genuinely matters in a very direct, measurable way. Every additional interceptor battery or missile shipment translates into fewer strikes getting through to hit apartment blocks, power infrastructure, and other civilian targets. Reports this week described Russian drone and missile strikes hitting multiple districts of Kyiv with a rising toll of dead and injured, a reminder that even as the ground war grinds along at a slow pace, the war being fought against Ukrainian civilians from the air continues at full intensity practically every week. Let's also spend a moment on the industrial side of this war, because it's easy to focus purely on individual strikes and lose sight of the cumulative economic effect. Ukraine's long-range strike campaign against Russian refineries hasn't been a handful of isolated hits, it's been a sustained, months-long effort hitting dozens of facilities repeatedly, sometimes returning to the same refinery multiple times as repairs are completed, specifically to keep capacity suppressed rather than allow a single dramatic strike to be quietly patched up and forgotten. The cumulative effect, as independent financial reporting has noted, has pushed Russian refining output down to levels not seen in more than 2 decades, which has real consequences: shortages and price spikes for fuel inside Russia itself, reduced export revenue at a time when the broader Russian economy is already under sanctions, pressure, and a documented scramble to find workarounds like moving fuel to frontline units through improvised, concealed methods rather than through the normal, efficient logistics chain that existed before the strikes began. War economies run on fuel just as much as front lines do, and this is one of the clearest examples in the whole conflict of a strategic campaign producing effects that reach far beyond the specific facility that gets hit on any given night. It's also worth touching briefly on the broader question of Western support and how it's evolving, because that shapes everything else we've discussed. The European package reportedly under discussion during von der Leyen's visit, in the range of €18 billion, reflects a broader pattern of European governments gradually stepping up their share of the military and financial burden, partly in response to shifting political signals from Washington about the pace and scale of American commitment going forward. France's decision to license domestic missile and air defense production inside Ukraine is part of the same broader trend. Rather than simply shipping finished weapons systems, Allied governments are increasingly looking at ways to help Ukraine build sustainable domestic production capacity, which matters enormously for long-term resilience, regardless of how any individual future funding debate in Washington, Brussels, or elsewhere plays out. This shift toward localized production isn't happening overnight, and Ukraine still depends heavily on imported components, munitions, and finished systems for a great deal of its capability, but the direction of travel is toward greater self-sufficiency over time, which is a meaningful strategic development in its own right.
Finally, let's close with a note on how to read all of this information responsibly. because this matters more in this war than in almost any conflict in recent memory, given how much of the coverage circulates through social media, open source mapping projects, and independent commentary channels rather than traditional wire services alone. Battlefield maps produced by projects that track daily changes in control are genuinely useful and, on the whole, have earned a reasonable reputation for accuracy. But they still rely on visual confirmation from photos, videos, and geolocated footage, which means there's inevitably a lag between something happening on the ground and it being reflected accurately on a public map. Claims of casualties, vessel losses, or territorial gains from either side's official channels should be treated as claims from an interested party rather than neutral fact until they are corroborated by independent trackers, satellite imagery analysts, or multiple separate sources converging on the same figure. That doesn't mean dismissing official reporting outright. Both Ukrainian and Russian claims have, at various points, held up reasonably well under independent scrutiny, but it does mean holding a healthy amount of caution before treating any single number as settled truth, especially numbers that spread quickly through commentary channels without a clear underlying source. That's the rundown for today. As always, keep in mind that frontline assessments shift quickly. Official figures from either side should be treated with appropriate skepticism until corroborated by independent trackers. And the situation around Ukraine's cabinet reshuffle in particular is still developing as of this recording. So some of what we've discussed regarding specific ministerial appointments may be confirmed or revised in the days ahead. One last thought before we close out. It's tempting, especially in a war this long and this brutal, to want a clean, simple story. One side clearly winning, the other clearly losing. A tidy arc heading toward a definite ending. The reality on the ground right now doesn't offer that. What it offers instead is a genuinely complicated picture. A Russian military that retains real capacity to strike deep into Ukraine and grind forward in isolated sectors at enormous cost. And a Ukrainian military and society that has shown remarkable adaptability under sustained pressure, building out drone and long-range strike capabilities that have meaningfully degraded Russia's war economy even while facing serious internal challenges of its own, from manpower constraints to the kind of governance disputes now playing out at the top of the Ministry of Defense. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and I think trying to force the situation into a simpler narrative, in either direction, does a disservice to how genuinely difficult and dynamic this conflict remains. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking how both the battlefield and the political situation in Kyiv develop from here.